Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, the podcast that interviews researchers to separate the science from the fiction in news headlines. I'm your host, Dr. Catherine Bates. I'm a youth development and mental health researcher from King's College London, and this is the Science or Fiction podcast. If you're listening to this on the day that it comes out, then it's the 1st of January 2024. Happy New Year. I hope you all managed to get some rest leading up to this new year. It's just me this week, which is why it might seem slightly awkward because I'm just talking into a camera by myself. But here we are. As it's the start of a new year, I thought I could tell you a bit about why I even make this podcast and what we've got coming up. And I'll also do some highlights of our previous episodes. So if you see or hear something that you like, you can go and check out those episodes online. So why are we here? I came up with the idea to do this podcast when I was working towards my PhD. So I started a funded master's and PhD studentship in 2016. So when I finished my psychology degree before that, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to get into research, I think, because research to me basically seemed like being able to make a job out of learning new stuff, which sounded very exciting. So when I finished my degree, I wasn't really sure what to do or how to get into it. I had no knowledge of academia. And I worked for a care services with people with brain injuries for a year. And at the same time, I was kind of just emailing people in the research world, so researchers at universities, asking for advice or asking if they were looking to hire anyone. And that's how I found out about the PhD funding. And then luckily I applied with a research proposal and got that funding. So I started that in 2016. And the studentship basically means that the funder will pay your tuition fees and you get a stipend. So you get a salary at the same time as doing that. So it's PhD, but it's also your job. So I did that at UCL and I studied mental imagery abilities in children with and without ADHD. And also how mental imagery ability relates to maths ability in children as well. And when I finished my PhD, I then went on to do a postdoc research position at King's, which is where I'm based now, King's College London. And in that, I was working on adversity, so how adverse experiences impact adolescent development. So we looked at brain structure, cognition, so how we think and behave, and mental health. So that might sound like quite a big change, which kind of is, but usually in research, a lot of it's focused on skills. So we basically develop skills to summarize, consume a lot of information, but we develop research skills as well, like analyzing big data sets or working with charities and things like that. So that was some of my transferable skills and now how I ended up here and kind of in the mental health adolescent development sphere, which I really enjoy. And now I'm working in the same group and I've just started a new project working on loneliness in socioeconomically marginalised young people. So that maybe gives you an idea that research can be really varied and you can do lots of different things. And honestly, each day is different. So that's fun. Yeah, I've gone off on a tangent. Why did I start the podcast? Within my PhD, I became really interested in science communication. And this is basically about not gatekeeping scientific findings. So trying to communicate the scientific findings outside of the world of academia. So I came up with the idea to do the podcast during my PhD when I was just getting frustrated with the way that research or science was portrayed in the media. So as I've mentioned on the podcast before, when science or research, and specifically mental health research, which is what we focus on at the moment in the podcast, is explained in news articles or portrayed in the news, it's often not accurate. And this can be for lots of different reasons. There's not like one person to blame. But I think partly because the news is now consumed in really short form content with catchy headlines that makes you want to click on it. So, for example, there was one in the Financial Times, I think last year, that said smartphones and social media are destroying children's mental health. And we simply just don't have evidence to support a claim like that. And if you listen to our very first episode with Louisa Farsi, she talks about this in more detail. So this was really my motivation for starting this podcast, to try and just provide a little bit more explanation around the evidence in mental health research findings and the way that they're reported in the news. So the hope is that by providing some more information about the mental health research and about how the study was conducted and what the evidence shows, that in the future, when we're reading about mental health research in the news, we might just be a bit more critical, and we might think, okay, what's actually going on here? How is this being described? And where can I find more information about it before I make a decision that might impact how I behave in the future? Another important part about what we do is integrate young people's lived experience or young people's input into the podcast. So because we focus on mental health and specifically youth mental health, it was really important to me that it wasn't just me coming up with the ideas and coming up with topics for those episodes, because sadly I'm not a young person anymore. So when we started the podcast and got some funding, we hired a young person consultant / producer. And this was Afra, who actually interviews someone with me in episode 5. So basically we created it together. So she provided lived experience ideas as a young person and what she wanted to know about mental health research. And she also conducted focus groups with other young people to find out what topics we should cover, what they thought of the format, and how we should be kind of portraying the information and explaining things. So that has been super helpful and something that we continue to do and will continue to do in 2024. So now you know a bit about why we're here and why we're making this podcast. Let's get into some highlights of our episode so far. In our first ever episode, we asked, does social media damage young people's mental health? We wanted to find out whether there was evidence to support this claim. So we interviewed Louisa Farsi, who's doing her PhD in social media and mental health at University of Cambridge, and this is what she had to say.
If we are talking about effects of time spent on social media on mental health, and headlines that say, oh, spending time on social media makes you depressed, I would say no. Like, we don't have evidence to hint at that.
In episode 2, we asked Professor Ulrika Schmidt, who's based at King's College London, about the prevalence of eating disorders in the UK. During the pandemic, there was lots of reporting in the news to suggest that the prevalence of eating disorders had increased. And so we wanted to find out why that might be and how we could support one another.
A lot of the time, I would think that eating disorders would have developed as a way of coping with some of the restrictions of the pandemic. So often quite innocently, but then developing a life of their own. And that's very often how eating disorders develop, that people start with positive intentions, wanting to make their lives a bit better, and end up locked into something that becomes very compulsive and becomes a problem in its own right.
In 2022, there was a huge trial that published quite a few papers and was covered in various news articles that was testing the effects of mindfulness training on anxiety and depression in children and young people. And they tested over 100,000 children. So we interviewed Dr. Darren Dunning in episode 3 of the podcast, and he was one of the lead researchers on this trial. And this is what he had to say about how the findings were reported.
I think the headline that mindfulness works under some circumstances, under some, mindfulness works a bit, that isn't the headline, is it really? It's just whereas mindfulness doesn't work as a sort of quite a nice headline. It gets the clicks, but I think that, as you say, it's much more nuanced, the actual story.
In episode 4, we talked to Jenna Spitzer, who's a PhD student studying climate change and young people's behaviours in the Netherlands. There's been a lot in the media about the burden of the climate crisis on young people and their mental health. So we asked how we can cope with this burden and potentially what we need to do to move forward and to support young people in facing this crisis.
Young people are frightened about the future. They do not feel like they can rely on their local and global governments to do enough to make their future better. And that is, I think, a real call for action at every level of society.
We then did a special episode where Afra and I interviewed clinical psychologist and researcher Dr. Eleanor Chatburn about mental health and mental ill health or mental illness. Afra worked as a young person consultant and a producer when we were setting up the podcast, so it was really cool to interview someone together. We asked Dr. Eleanor Chatburn how we differentiate between mental health and mental illness and how we can know when we've tipped over an edge and we need to seek support.
There are normal reasons to feel anxious. So say you've got exams coming up and you're going through a really difficult time. You kind of want to be a little bit anxious. You need that activation. You need enough stress hormones to do your best. Because if you're not motivated enough, you might not do any study at all. But then, like you say, at what point does that become a problem? So if someone's like so anxious months in advance of their exam that actually they're barely functioning and they're not sleeping and they're just feeling panicky, they're having panic attacks and they're not going out and seeing their friends, then things have kind of tipped over. And it sounds like, at that point, someone might be just so distressed and their anxiety, they've lost all control of the anxiety. So this is when I think you're thinking about really going to see a mental health professional who can do an individual assessment, because I think it's super hard for people to know, like, what's normal, right?
And that takes us up to our most recent episode on loneliness. So there's been evidence recently that's shown that young people experience some of the highest rates of loneliness compared to other age groups, which is quite surprising because we mostly talk about loneliness in elderly people. So we asked, why are young people so lonely and what can we do about it? And in this episode, we talked to a youth loneliness activist, Molly Taylor, and a loneliness researcher, Lily Verity. And it's really interesting because most of our episodes so far, all of our episodes so far, have focused on evidence from quantitative studies. So this is like looking at data and doing statistical analyses. Whereas Lily's research in loneliness has focused on qualitative data. This is basically where you ask people about their experiences and what they report forms the research findings. So in this episode, Molly talked about how engaging in the conversation around loneliness and taking part in research can actually help support and alleviate loneliness.
So actually, by having these conversations like we are now, feeling like I'm a participant here today and doing other research, I felt very valued and heard. And it's one way that I've actually overcome loneliness, because it's making me aware that there's a lot of work being done. But when you're in your room and you feel lonely and you're in that crippling mindset and feeling overwhelmed of anxiety, you don't realize that there are people trying to help you out there.
So I hope you've enjoyed this highlights episode. Thank you really to everyone who listens and to everyone who messages us on social media. It's really great to hear from you, and we really value your input. The loneliness episode is full of questions from listeners, so please do keep sending them in. We're going to be posting snippets from previous episodes on social media this month, and we're also going to be doing polls about what you want to hear in future episodes. When you see videos and posts on social media, especially Instagram, please do share and bookmark the videos, and make sure that you subscribe on whichever platform you listen on, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, etc. It really helps us reach more people. You can find us at Science or Fiction Pod on Instagram and at Sci or Fiction Pod on Twitter or X. We're hoping to launch a new TikTok channel in 2024. If you want to email us, you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk. We've got loads of interesting guests and even a live podcast event coming up in the new year, so make sure you look out for that. We release new episodes on the first Monday of every month. So see you next time.